Welcome to Power Talks with Santosh Shah. Today we have with us Charles Haviland, BBC correspondent for Nepal, and Thomas Kelly, a celebrated photographer. Nepal has been a focus for global media since last one decade, and probably more than half the world has looked into Nepal through the eyes, minds and hearts of Thomas Kelly and Charles Haviland, two prominent media persons. Charles, you have seen Nepal progress politically over the last 5 years. How do you assess this growth or this change? And how do you see the future of Nepal in terms of positive growth or negative growth?
Well, it's been remarkable, I think, that to take the broader view, just to compare where we are now in Nepal with where we were 3 years ago. 3 years ago there was a war going on, a debilitating, violent, nasty, unpleasant war with massive human rights violations. Today there's no war. Today there is largely peace in this country, and that's something I think that Nepalis are thankful for. But of course, looking close up and short term and at what's going on in the ground, it's not all rosy by any means. There is still a lot of violence in this country. Violence is still very much part of politics, particularly in the south of the country. There are shortages of everything. There are shortages of electricity. There are shortages of water. There are shortages of fuel. Some of these things are man-made shortages. Some of them are, of course, owing to nature and natural processes. And there is also a culture of achieving your political aim through threats, through violence, through the band, through the enforced shutdown and stoppage. So those things, of course, are much gloomier, and they are something that this country has to work through. I think in terms of the political situation, we're still seeing how the Maoists are doing in government. It hasn't been many months. It wouldn't be right at all to write off their record at the moment. They're doing some progressive things. So there's a lot going on in this country, a lot of conflicting dynamics, good and bad. We can't really see exactly where the country is heading.
Thomas, we have seen the political change, but in your point of view, do you see the beautiful landscapes of Nepal change its color, or is it still the same that it was in the past?
It very much depends where I'm photographing, or where whoever it might be, because certainly some areas have incredible nature beauty, such as up in Solukhumbu, the Paflu area, some of these more remote areas that are for the most part unchanged. But then obviously if you talk about going to the Tarai, right, or going into other areas where there's a denser population, of course the picture frame is changing.
In 2006 February, you were the first one who saw Prachanda in real, in flesh and blood. He was in hiding for 20 years, and nobody actually believed that he existed in real. You have seen Prachanda as a successful rebel leader, as a successful politician. Do you think he's going to be a successful prime minister as well?
Well, I wouldn't say no one believed he existed back in 2006, but I think a lot of people doubted, because most of the pictures of him that were available were drawings. There weren't many photographs. And it was quite remarkable to walk into this room in the place where he was then underground and actually see this flesh and blood man sitting on a sofa. Of course, others had interviewed him for the press in the preceding weeks, but it was still a remarkable moment. I feel quite privileged to have been in on that. 2 years after that, I interviewed him in his residence in Kathmandu in Naya Bazar, and then just a couple of weeks back, I interviewed him in the prime ministerial residence. So just in terms of the background and the environment, I think in terms of being a prime minister, I think he's really struggling. Yet he sort of says now that being a rebel leader was easier than being a prime minister. And I think that he hasn't been able to drop the idiom of rebellion and revolt, which makes a lot of people fear that the Maoists may be plotting something more, talking about seizing the state. It's not really clear what his grand design is, or indeed how many grand designs his party has, but I think there's absolutely no doubt at the moment whether they believe in long-term democracy or not. I think he is struggling with the day-to-day problems of being a politician, and when he accuses other parties of not cooperating, he is sincere in a way, but he is perhaps learning that that's all part of coalition government and politics. And of course government in Nepal has traditionally been a very weak thing.
Thomas, you came to Nepal in 1978, and you've seen the beautiful landscapes of the Himalayas. Now the world is facing global warming and climate change. In your opinion, how has the climate change affected the Himalayas?
I wouldn't say that I'm an expert on the climate change issue. I haven't been focusing on that necessarily. Some of the glacial melting in areas, obviously that is a visual evidence, and these lakes that are forming in certain areas, and obviously the discussion about potential flooding due to that has become more and more of a concern. So it's you can see that it's some of the mixtures that are going on there.
Both of you have witnessed and lived through this change in Nepal. We had the Maoist revolution, then we had the royal takeover, and then we had the restoration of democracy, the elections of the constitution, and now we are a republic nation. And how has your experience been living through this historic period of Nepal?
As a journalist, I feel privileged to have witnessed all this, and it's been remarkable, the change to a republic, certainly. Covering the war was, of course, covering something that was horrible. But it's also just been incredibly moving, and I'm sure Tom, who's lived here much longer than I have would agree, just the hospitality that you get in people's homes. The other day, I was interviewing a family who are torn down the middle because their son is in the Nepal army and two of their daughters are in the Maoist PLA. We were all together in this village in Kotang, in the Eastern Hills, and just we were welcomed like family into their home, given wonderful food, given the most comfortable bedroom to sleep in, and that is to me the trademark of this country.
Thomas, how has your experience been in Nepal so far?
So I very much agree with what Charles was saying. It's just been an extraordinary privilege to have lived here as long as I have. The beginning periods of my time here, obviously in the Peace Corps, doing a certain service, I was 21 years old then. I'm 52 now. Right, and I was idealistic, romantic, hardworking. If people didn't work, I would go out with a pickaxe. There was a certain amount of frustration and so on. But at the end of the day, over dalbat, mixing, speaking, joking, and so on and so forth, it took me a long time to peel away my own frustrations and get used to the tempo and rhythm here. And then working as a development officer for CARE, I got back involved in understanding people's situations and trying to bring what I had experienced to the table firsthand. The war was certainly, I wasn't totally involved with in the sense of reporting on a day-to-day basis, but I chose certain stories that I had interest in. The Devi Sunwar story was a story that I broke with the New York Times, and that was really going out into strongly held Maoist areas and talking to the Maoists. That was some of my first time that I got to do that. So I was away from the romance, the ethnography, and so on and so forth, and hearing both sides. It made me sad to a certain extent. It showed me challenges that the country was going to face and is definitely facing now. Moving on through that and now to this peace accord that has taken place and watching how the situation is developing, and I'm really proud of this, or I'm happy about this social inclusion, but I don't think that the country is going to be ruled on dividing it up along ethnic grounds. It's a tremendous concern of mine. It's got to be worked with, a socioeconomic situation. I think this Madesi or the Nepal situation, and the Tarai and these Pahari and so on and so forth, they have to work together. The camera is the tool, right, to be able to try to create the context of where these answers are coming from, and coming in and asking some sensitive questions like this.
We'll continue our conversation after a short break. Do stay with us. Welcome back to Power Talks with Santosh Shah. We are in conversation with Charles Haviland and Thomas Kelly. Charles, can you tell us about one of your most memorable moments in Nepal?
Well, there have been many memorable moments. I suppose the culmination of Jana Andolan and watching that, if you like, relinquishment speech by former King Gyanendra on TV was a remarkable moment. But in terms of locations, the whole country is beautiful, but I suppose the high Himalayas are the summit, not to make a pun of it. I did a story up at the Cho Rolpa Glacial Lake at the top of the Rolwaling Valley, which was a place I'd wanted to go anyway. Looking at the global warming issue, there was an intense human dimension to that as well. The mountains just are a gift to a television journalist like me. And also last April when we went up to Everest Base Camp to look at the controversy over the Chinese Olympic torch, and were more or less thrown out of base camp by a ministry from the Nepal tourism official because he said we weren't allowed to talk to any reporters. That was astonishing, but we managed to go live on TV just around the corner from base camp, and a nice backdrop and a memorable trip.
Thomas, you have covered a wide range of subjects over the last 3 decades, from the beautiful landscapes of the mountains, the issues of trafficking and sex trade in South Asia. Can you recall some of your best moments in Nepal?
There's been so many. I kind of celebrate every moment that I'm here. Early on, running with Trans-Himalayan traders over passes in the Humla area, and just feeling that freedom through exercise, through walking, through being apart with a team of people, and being able to document that. The issues that you mentioned with trafficking was kind of a result of my time in Humla when you're dealing with migrant labor. So that was a pivotal moment for me to look more seriously into that. But I remember one particular situation where I rode back from the border from Mumbai on the train for 36 hours and then got to the border and then rode with 28 young ladies, young Nepalese ladies, to Kathmandu, and they had to go through a horrible battery of tests and not just very unpleasant experiences. So there are rewarding moments. Yeah.
Charles, what has been one most difficult situation in Nepal while reporting? I remember last year your vehicle in Tarai was almost torched or broken during the Madhesa Andolan.
I think that was actually one of the most difficult moments. We were in the highway. We were somewhere west of Lahan in Siraha district. It was actually 2 years ago. It was the start of the first Madhesa Andolan, but time flies, doesn't it? Anyway, we were trying to get west for our next interviews, and the highway was blocked. I think it was at Mirchaya. And the crowd that gathered around us wasn't the sort of benevolent crowd that you normally get in this country. It was a very hostile crowd. And we were sort of talking our way through, and there were some leaders who were trying to get us through, and then we had just heard this loud smash, and I think it was our back windscreen that was shattered. That was nasty, because you're taught when you go on so-called hostile environment courses, how to cope with a hostile crowd like that, how to get out of it, and it was quite an exercise in diplomacy to get out of it. But that was an alarming moment.
Thomas, have you encountered any similar situation in Nepal?
I think that when I was asked by the New York Times to go and cover the Debbie Sunwar story up in Pokhari Chowri, that was difficult because there was no advance warning sent. It was just basically being able to go into that area with a certain level of confidence with another reporter, at that time David Rhodes from the New York Times. I wasn't welcomed, right, as a Anglo white-faced Bidesi into this area. And so even though I was motivated to be able to tell a story that I felt needed to be told, I had to go through lots of hoops and interrogations. I think similar, it all took place during the Maoist time period.
That article and photographs you did at that time was actually on the New York Times in a huge coverage. So that was a big success.
Yeah, it was. I actually didn't know that it was going to receive front cover. So yes, that was a bit of a twist.
Charles, during the last 2 years, we have seen more journalists killed in Nepal. Recently, Uma Singh was killed brutally. And how safe do you feel as a journalist?
Yeah, that was a horrendous murder. And then we had Jagat Joshi, we had Birendra Shah, we have had the disappearance, I think, of Prakash Thakuri and others since, the so-called end of the conflict. The war is over, but violence continues, and I think for journalists, it's been worse. And we mustn't forget that, just the other day, 3 people murdered in Janakpur, not much fuss was made about that in the press for some reason, but it happened. I, as a foreign journalist, feel absolutely no threat at all. I think this is a bizarre country in a way, but of course journalists, particularly in the south, come under this pressure, from different factions inside saying, report what we do, or don't report these misdemeanors by us. And That's partly because there is, unfortunately, still a certain bias in certain sections of the media. It's very distressing. It's not something that affects people like me, as I say. But I think in places like Janakpur, Siraha, Saptari, maybe sometimes in places like Kapilvastu in the west, life is very, very difficult indeed.
We'll continue this conversation after a short break. Do stay with us. Welcome back to Power Talks with Santosh Shah. We are in conversation with Charles Haviland and Thomas Kelly. Thomas, Nepal is no longer a Hindu nation and a royal regime. It's for someone who has photographed the Hindu aspects of Nepal and also the royal aspect of Nepal, does it feel like there's a voidness in Nepal right now?
No, I don't think so. The other day I was in Bhaktapur photographing Bardhaman during the Chait. The other day Satamachindranath took place, pulling of the chariot, the Kumari coming out. These rituals within the valley are still, I think, very strong. I think the difference is they're not being supported. The festivals for the Newars and to a certain extent to the Kirans and the Gurungs and Tamangs and so on, I think that it runs in their blood. And it also, I think it will continue. I certainly hope it will continue. The ritual time is something that's very sacred here and embraced, and is also one of the reasons that keeps me here.
Religion is just essential to life, whether Hinduism, Buddhism, smaller religions, and very much the lifeblood of the country. And of course, note that the Maoists realised the importance of that. A few months ago, big controversy when they tried to sack all the Indian priests at Pashupatinath and replace them with Nepali ones. So they're meddling, if you like, in religious affairs, which is strange, very strange for an avowedly atheist government. But there's no way that religion is just going to melt away. And of course we've had the president sinking almost seamlessly into many of the roles that the king used to fulfill. Something I challenged the president when I interviewed him, what if there's a Muslim president in future, or a Christian one, or a Buddhist one? That question hasn't really been answered yet.
The coverage and conflict of Nepal over the last 1 decade has clearly affected the tourism of Nepal. And there's clearly a demand of a lot of negative news around the world, not just Nepal, but anywhere in the world. But in your case, you have also done a lot of human interest stories from Nepal, which has in a way helped us, and we're grateful to you for that. Where do we find that balance about a country which is in war?
I think it's important to show both sides. I really don't think that one should be deflected from journalism by the fact that it might affect tourism in a country, because journalists do have to try and tell the story as it is. It's an interesting question, because the very first television feature I did from Nepal was about where does the conflict meet the tourism. The extraordinary beauty of that season made the story all the more traumatic. I think it's a moot point as to how much it's affected tourism, because I know that some trekkers were rather swept away by the, I think, mistakenly romanticised view of the Maoists. Obviously war brings down tourism, but I think more of a problem for tourists is the sheer inconvenience that you get so much with these perpetual shutdowns, often for extremely obscure and opaque reasons that hamper people's ability to travel, and of course hamper local people far worse than they do tourists.
Thomas, we're still in a very historic time of conflict. People are trying to find out ways how the country can move forward. How do you envision the future of Nepal?
It's certainly a mixed situation going on. I think it's a rather idealistic outlook, but I've asked myself this question many times about, okay, if I was having to be in the driver's seat, what would be some of the programs I would initiate? Or how can I give a positive reinforcement to youth that want to go overseas? You know, it's an intelligentsia drain on the country, and I'm very sad every time a great photographer friend of mine or a great journalist or a technician says bye and gives up on this country. So how do I say, come on, you have to stay behind. Don't you love your own country? I love it dearly. I care about this country. I think it would be a wonderful program to have Nepalese youth to go out and do volunteer work in wherever it might be. It can be in the city, it can be in the hills, for a certain amount of period. And there should be some strings attached to that, whether it's monetary or at least certainly recognized to be able to take the next step forward.
Charles, you'll be heading out to Sri Lanka very soon, but I'm sure you'll still stay connected to Nepal. In that sense, how do you envision Nepal's future?
Very much. I will continue to visit Nepal as a tourist, or maybe some other capacity in the future. I think looking at Nepal's future, poverty is the issue I think that matters. I think people didn't vote for the Maoists because they particularly identified with their ideology. I think they hope that the Maoists can make good on their promises to bring people out of poverty. End to discrimination, yes. People lay great hopes in the Constituent Assembly. It's brought Dalits, it's brought people from backward regions. But I think people would like to see a new constitution written not just by the same bunch of Brahmin men leading the same old parties, which at the moment is an open question which way it's going to go. This is a society where ethnic diversity is just part of the fabric of life. And I think that the process towards more ethnic feeling and more exclusive ethnic feeling, which we're seeing now, which I think the Maoists were quite largely responsible for encouraging in an attempt to get people on side during the war. I think this is rebounding in so many people's faces, and it is a can of worms. It's a patchwork country. It's not a country that can be divided up on ethnic basis, and yet everyone's still talking about what kind of ethnic federalism do we want. Federalism, even in its own right in a fairly small country, is not necessarily what's needed, but ethnic federalism, I think, is a great danger, and I think that Nepal would do well to step back from that brink. I don't want to end on a negative note. I actually think that, like many others here, that sometimes there appear to be great dangers here, and Nepal has a history and habit of stepping back from the brink, and I do have confidence that will happen.
We can only hope that we can combine youths, education and agriculture and see a prosperous country, at least created by the people itself. With this hope, I would wish you good luck and goodbye. See you next week, the same time.